All right, this video is over section 4, working with ratios and proportions. Begins on page 25 in your packet. And this first table kind of just gives us some general information, and the first page is working with ratios. So we'll kind of go this pretty quickly, go through this. Colombians to Mexicans. Notice that in this, that was question 1, we have firearm deaths and population. So when you're thinking about what ratio you're going to write, you got to make sure you're paying attention to the wording. So in question 1, they talk about the ratio of Colombians to Mexicans. It doesn't say anything about firearm deaths. So for number 1, we are dealing with population. So the ratio of Colombians to Mexicans, right? Well, how many Colombians do we have? We've got 46.3 million. Compared to 112 million Mexicans. Since they're both in millions, it's okay that I don't write the millions out, right? If I would reduce that, it would come down. I would go ahead and just leave it written as this. It says 2 different ways. I'll let you go ahead and write those in different ways. Okay, so let's kind of just go through the rest of these questions from this table. Now, in number 2, they go to firearm deaths. And I would recommend actually hitting pause, answer the rest of these questions, and then come back and watch this and make sure that you got it right. So go ahead and hit pause, do that, and then we'll come back and do it. So number 2, ratio of firearm deaths in Colombia to firearm deaths in Mexico. Well, now we are 13,029 compared to 12,510. And I'm going to go ahead and just write it with a colon because it's easier to write that way on this app. And yes, that can be reduced, but because the numbers are so big, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it like that for now. And number 3, U.S. citizens to Australian citizens. So again, now we're back to people. So U.S. comes first, so that number has to come first. And then let's compare it to the Australians, and that's 22.3. Now it says, and interpret its meaning. You can go ahead and use that ratio, or remember how we talked about dividing it and going to per Australian? So if I would divide that, I would get 13.86 Americans, so that's every U.S. people for every 1 Australian. And that could help you interpret the meaning or write your sentence of there are 13.86 U.S. citizens to every 1 Australian citizens. Okay, number 4, of the countries listed, minimum value in firearm deaths. Well, the minimum is UK. UK only had 158. The maximum would be the US, and the US had 32,548 firearm deaths. Now, number 5 kind of brings us to the concept of population. Well, what's the range of population? Remember what range means? Range is the largest. So the largest is the US at 309 million, minus the smallest, and the smallest is, Australia at 22.3 million. If you subtract those, you get 286.7 million, and there is the range. The range of firearm deaths, well, the U.S. has the most firearm deaths at 32,548, minus the UK of 158, and that gives us the range of 32,390. All right, let's move on to page number 26. Page 26 has more questions. Ooh, that's kind of fuzzy. We'll go ahead and just kind of work through. This is more ratios. U.S. population to Canadian. Again, hit pause, finish these, and then come back and check your answers. So U.S. population to the Canadian population would be 309 to 35. It does ask you to change that to a decimal. Remember, we'll divide to get it to a decimal, and I get 8.83. So that means there are 8.83 U.S. people to every 1 Canadian. A. Yeah. Number 7, find the ratio of Canadian to U.S. So now we're just going to flip it. So if I would put the Canadians first to 309 Americans, if I change that to a decimal, I get 0.113. So there are 0.113 Canadians to every 1 U.S. person, right? So 6 and 7 are kind of flippages of each other. Number 8, what is it? Does it mean anything to compare the number of firearm deaths between 2 countries without taking the population into consideration? My strong answer is no. I mean, it makes sense to me that the U.S. would have more firearm deaths because we have a ton more people. You can't compare a country with 309 million people to a country with 35 million people and expect to have any sense out of that without taking into account the population. So you can just think on that for a minute. Number 9 is a question I'm not a big fan of because there are so many other variables that go into it. I'm just not even going to address it. This lovely blank page deals with more scientific notation. So if you remember, we've done problems like 3,450,000. And if we want to change that to scientific notation, right, our decimal starts at the end, and we want to move it to become between 1 and 10. So we get 3.45, and we moved it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 places, so we have 10 to the 6th. Well, now we're getting into negative exponents, and we played with them a little bit in the first part, but we get into it more now. So if I would have like 0.00045, well, now we see our decimal, but we want to move it over here. So 4.5 times 10 to the 1, 2, 3, 4, negative 4. And it's negative because in standard form, we are a really, really, really small number. So if you want to go the other way, if I have 6.87 times 10 to the negative third. Well, the negative third tells us, right, the 3 is you're going to move your decimal 3 places. Negative means your number is getting smaller. So 1, 2, 3. So I'll start with a decimal. Notice I've got these 2 blank spots. Blank spots always mean zeros. And then I have the rest of the number. So that's kind of page 27. Go ahead and read through that. I'm not going to spend too much time on that one. The next page, I'm just going to put, or the next couple pages, I'm going to put the answers for page 28. So that way you can go through page 28, hit pause, do questions 1, 2, and 3, which are dealing with scientific notation, and then come back and just check your answers. All right, so I did my pages, so I had to squish these all into one to make it work. But there are the answers for 1, 2, and 3. Check those out. If you have questions on them of, hey, I didn't get that, feel free to shoot me an email, and we can get more into them as we need to. So going in, page 29. Now we are on page 29. Firearm deaths. So I'm going to talk about how you go through and get this, and I'm going to have you fill in the rest of the chart. So firearm deaths per capita. Per capita means per person. So you'll notice that here our population. So talking about Australia, to get this number, they took the population, or death per capita. So they took their firearm deaths, 236, and divided by the population. The population is in millions. So 22, and after that whole number, we need 6 decimal places because of the millions. Now, we already have a 3, so after the 3, I need 5 zeros. If you divide those two numbers, more than likely your calculator will automatically spit it out into scientific notation, which is fine because we have a column for that. And then you can go, so standard form, right, here's the first column, standard form, and then we've got scientific notation. And this last column is firearm deaths per 100,000. You'll notice that these first 2 columns, these numbers are very small, these two, right? It's hard to kind of understand what it means to have such a small number. So if you multiply by 100,000, so take your decimal, this number, multiply by 100,000, and that's how you get this number. That kind of gives you a better sense. So in Australia, out of 100,000 people, 1.06 of them can expect to die by firearm death. Okay, so knowing that, go ahead and do your division of firearm deaths divided by population. Fill out the rest of this chart. So hit pause, fill out the chart in your book, and then come back and check it out, and I'll have all the answers in here. All right, I actually just filled in that last column because it's hard to write in such a small spot with my fat fingers. But if your firearm deaths per 100,000, if they match mine, then the other 2 columns are probably right as well. So we will use this column to answer questions on page 30. Maybe not. So page 30. Go ahead and hit pause, answer the questions on page 30, and then come back and check your answers. I'll have them written up here on a couple slides. So we are on page 30. Okay, so your answers on page 30. You'll notice in 5 and 7 we've got statements, and 28.14 firearm deaths out of 100,000 people in Colombia. In number 7, there are 10.53 firearm deaths in Australia, or in the U.S. for every 1.06 firearm deaths in Australia. If you change that to be per capita, so you went per 1, your numbers might be a little off there. Same in number 6. You could have written those ratios in different ways. And then number 8 talks about putting them in order, right, least to greatest for the population of firearm deaths, and then firearm deaths per 100,000. You'll notice that the U.S. has the biggest population, the most firearm deaths, but when you think about it in terms of per 100,000, notice where the U.S. is right in the middle. So even though it has a lot of firearm deaths and has a lot of people, we are not the most firearm deaths per capita. So I just like to point that out because I think it's important. Okay, let's get into proportions, and actually I think I'm going to make that a new video. So we'll just call this the ratio review portion of this. So that's this first video.